Okay. Uh, Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Fred Wary and Leila Bougagas. Fred's book is really a remarkable book, I think. I've reported some on Libya, but not nearly as much as Fred has. It's a book that is an incredibly rich book. It contains multiple stories. It contains the story of what happened in the 2011 revolt, the story about what happened to Chris Stevens. It talks about the whole story of ISIS in Libya, and then, of course, the refugees that passed through Libya, and then the story of Haftar, the Libyan strongman who may be passing into history. We don't know. Anyway, each one of these, I think, could be the subject of a book. And this book is full of amazing reporting, which took considerable courage to do, and it's beautifully written as well. We're fortunate to have here also with us Leila Bougagas, who's the CEO and Deputy Director General of the Benghazi Medical Center, right? Former, sorry, who has done lots of brave medical work in Libya. Member of the Scientific Committee for Reproductive Health of Libya. Is that also former? Or is it?
Well, that was when I was in Libya, yes.
Okay, yeah. And continues to do human rights work. And she also can tell us, I think, about her experience there, particularly in Benghazi, where she did extremely brave work. I want to start off just by asking Fred, what led you to write this book?
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Robert, for moderating, and thank you especially to Dr. Leila, given her role in a lot of the events in the book, and especially her role in the life of Benghazi. My purpose in this book, I think, was really to try to correct an impression in the American public consciousness that Libya's, history sort of ended in 2011 or 2012. That you had this narrative that the intervention destroyed Libya, the revolution failed, and what followed was simply chaos. What I argue is Libyans are still working out their political destiny. As the subtitle of the book suggests, there is a battle for Libya right now. There's an ongoing struggle, so I try to give Libyans agency. I think there's a contest of different visions of political order for this country. The first vision was a democratic civic vision. This was the motive for the first protests at the Benghazi courthouse on February 17th, and that vision expressed itself in 2012 with the elections for the General National Congress. The question is, why has that vision proven so hard to implement? There were a number of other visions. There were regionalist visions, the federalist visions. There was a vision that looked to the past with the monarchists. There was, unfortunately, an exclusionary vision with the architects of the political isolation law. There were ideological visions from the jihadists. You had certain visions that were centered around particular towns and their supremacy. And later on, you had an authoritarian militarist vision for the country. And I think today, unfortunately, you have people that don't have any vision at all, that are frankly motivated purely by political power and by profit, as a UN report just made clear. So I'm trying to tell the story of Libya's politics, unpack the politics to show that the unraveling of the country was not preordained after 2011, that there were a number of steps taken, there were missed opportunities, there were mistakes by both Libyans and the international community. The second purpose of the book is to move from the abstract to the personal and to sort of humanize Libya's story by profiling, obviously, the key political players, but more importantly, ordinary Libyans, the activists who first gathered at the courthouse. What became of them? Many were exiled, some murdered, some found themselves on opposing sides of a civil war. The young Libyans who get caught up in militias, why do they join? A Libyan who joins the Islamic State, what's his motivation? I want to take readers also to communities that have been long neglected, the Tebu and the Tuareg, the ethno-linguistic minorities in the south, who after the revolution were cooperating, but then unfortunately fought each other in the town of Ubari. And so this is just meant to sort of convey the stories of Libyans who were caught up in the turmoil, and also non-Libyans, the migrants who traversed Libya's territory looking for a better life and unfortunately suffered untold abuses in these detention centers, which is one of the great moral tragedies of our time. And the third purpose is to really sort of do a post-mortem on American policy and international policy in Libya. The decision to intervene in this country is well known, but I think the real story is the first year after Qaddafi's fall, when the Obama administration really abdicated the responsibility for nation building, for any follow-up to the United Nations, to the Europeans, who then in turn said the Libyans own this. And so I have a section in my book that's called No Ownership. Nobody wanted to own this. Of course, the Libyans needed to own this, but unfortunately they inherited from Qaddafi a system of governance that really didn't leave them with the skills to do that. So I think there were a number of international missteps in the first year, the sort of rush to elections, the failure by the United Nations to deal with the security sector, and then of course the tragic attack of Benghazi, which I reconstruct using court records through interviews with Libyans on the ground. The war in the Beltway is well known, but I think the real effect was felt in the city itself. And what did that attack do to America's presence in Benghazi, to America's presence in the country? It really constrained it. By the time the Obama administration wanted to re-engage in Libya in 2013, I think it was too late. They had an ill-fated effort to try to train a Libyan army. So I think there are multiple lessons from this episode for American foreign policy.
I just want to briefly pick up on what you said. This is much more than a book of political analysis. There are a number of, I think, really unforgettable portraits of people in this book, including Salwa Bugaigas, the human rights lawyer who did incredibly brave work and paid with her life for it. Incidentally, she's the cousin of Dr. Layla with us here today. And let me just then turn to you and ask you to talk a little bit about Benghazi, because in 2011, when the Libyan revolt took place, shortly after the drama of Tahrir Square in Cairo, suddenly all the attention was focused on Benghazi, the first city in Libya to liberate itself from Qaddafi. I was one of the many, many reporters who showed up at that time in February to this town that was undergoing this kind of wild sense of, ecstatic celebration, having fought this very brief but very bloody conflict. You're from Benghazi. Tell us, what was it like at that time? And then can you take us a little bit forward as well? After all, there was quite a relatively long period, let's say, when things seemed positive for Libya, when there still seemed the chance that some of the other countries of the Arab uprisings were beginning to go south, things were starting to turn violent. But in 2011 and 12, there was still a lot of hope for Libya. Can you tell us first about Benghazi, what it was like to be there at that time, and then how things gradually began to get worse up to the death of Chris Stevens?
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Fred, and thank you. Thanks also to Carnegie for hosting me, and thank you for inviting me to this event. Reading the book has really been a sentimental journey for me, because it did take me from the Gaddafi days, where coming from Benghazi, there are so many stories to tell about a very long period of an oppressive tyrant regime, especially in cities like Benghazi and Derna, where a lot of his oppression was focused. And then the book takes us from the era of Gaddafi and dismantling and of the state, where at one point Fred says in his book that by 1990 Libya was in ruins, which is quite true, and then takes us to the revolution days and the feelings that we had in February 2011. On the 15th of February 2011, there was shock. The the youth and the women who started this whole, the incident that started this whole uprising on that day, and the stories that the youth, and obviously many of them are our family and relatives and friends and neighbors and people of Benghazi, they couldn't believe what was happening. So I can say that one of them said that, and he told me this actually. He said he's getting bold. He's 32 years old and he's getting a bit bold. And he said my knees were shaking and I felt a few hairs left on my head were going to fall down because I couldn't believe that we were actually marching in Benghazi and saying we want, the regime to fall. We want, Gaddafi out. So people waited for this. They wanted it. People were desperate. 43 years of desperation. But the people of Libya, this is a story about people who, and a country that has historically been, exposed to decades of occupation and tyranny. And so the people were desperate for change. They wanted liberty. They wanted their rights. They wanted freedom. They wanted justice, social justice and justice of all types. They wanted their rights, citizenship and human rights. So it was a very big event, and our feelings, until today, we all remember those feelings of that February. We cannot forget them. We felt this euphoria, this strength, this power. We felt that we have ownership. Finally, we may be getting our country back. So it was a fantastic feeling, and it was a popular uprising at that point. Regardless of, a lot of what we hear and a lot of what we read about today, but it was at that time a popular uprising. In Benghazi, all of the people marched in the streets during the first days of the uprising. And in 5 days, most of eastern Libya was actually freed from Gaddafi's regime, which was a shock to everyone. It was really shocking. So I think that what happened after that is that this euphoria, this feeling of ownership, this happiness struck us, and we thought that finally, we can work hard and rebuild our country and rebuild the institutions and reform things and, reform the educational system, the healthcare, the, judicial system, the politics. Women and youth were empowered. They had ownership. They were, there was civil society for the first time in Libya. We never had civil society before. The only 2 or 3 organizations, had to be affiliated with the previous regime and their, the sons and daughter of Gaddafi. So for the first time, civil society, for the first time, people are working hard to build something from nothing. Then, things started to change, obviously. And one of the things that I really like about Fred's book is that he touches on all of these issues. He shows the human side of the Libya conflict, because nowadays all we know and read about Libya is armed conflict, is militia, is ISIS, is terrorism, is migrant, problems and refugees. But there is another side. The majority of the Libyan people, the silent majority, are not involved in all of this conflict and politics and what's happening. They're actually suffering silently. They're the ones that, did this, that participated in this popular uprising to have some rights and to have their freedom and liberty, but, things didn't work well. I can't say, as you mentioned, that the revolution failed, though, because, revolutions, they're unpredictable, and the outcomes usually can only be, analyzed properly many years later, So usually revolutions, if they change the regime, then they have succeeded. But what comes after the revolution, is unpredictable as well. So maybe, anyway, so in the book, actually, then Fred goes on to talk about how this euphoria and how the dream of the Libyan people started, but then something went wrong. And by the end of 2011, in Benghazi was a hub. Everybody came to Benghazi in 2011, everyone. People left Tripoli through Tunisia and came to Benghazi because the regime was still there in Tripoli, so they didn't have a voice there. Everybody suddenly had a voice. Every single Libyan. Libyans never had a voice before. They could never speak. Everybody had a voice and everybody participated in something. So it was like Gaddafi had put a veil on Libya, the veil was removed, and suddenly you have all of these people trying to do something and trying to talk. So all of the international community came to Benghazi. The organizations, the United Nations, the ambassadors, the diplomatic missions, the presidents. I mean, you know, the British Prime Minister, Macron, Sarkozy in 2011. And so it was really a hub, you know, and I remember that we used to stay out till 1 a.m. working, you know, because we were so excited about this new era that was going to come. But then little by little things started to change. And by the end of 2011, we started seeing some, you know, violence. And then in 2012, you know, and Fred mentions in the book how, you know, incidents started to happen, attacks on the international missions, on the Red Cross, on the British mission, on actually even the French mission. It was, you know, acts of violence started to occur, and we were too busy, still in this, you know, working hard and thinking that we are going to rebuild this new, modern, civil, just Libya, you know, and we are going to have a democratic Libya, finally. So we were too busy to look, you know, thoroughly and see what was going on. And the other problem is that, and this is also another thing that Fred mentions in the book, which is very important, the international community helped us to win our, you know, to gain, you know, what we gained in the revolution. They helped us to topple the regime, but the next day they abandoned us. And we are a country that has no experience. We were not allowed to participate in politics. We were not allowed to have civil society. Not only that, our ministries and our institutions were dismantled by Gaddafi. And also, I used to call the ministries during the Gaddafi regime the eggshell ministries. They were, you know, they were really nothing, just a person, a man who was appointed by Gaddafi, and it was a one-man show. But inside, there was nothing. We had no governance, no real laws, no real, you know, organization inside those institutions. So we were people with no experience, really, and we were left alone. So, you know, everybody came, and I think the proxy started right then. There was a lot of meddling in Libya, and then things started getting out of hand, and we came to this, you know, horrible day where one day Chris Stevens was tragically, you know, he tragically died in this incident in Benghazi, and things really changed since then. After a couple of weeks, I remember we went out in the streets of Benghazi, thousands of people. It was the biggest march in Benghazi since the revolution days. And we called for the end of violence, for the end of militias, for getting back, you know, the civil work that started. But things, again, ended badly on that day. And from then on, we started having more violence and more meddling, and we started seeing a lot of changes. Militarization of everything, you know, started happening, and suddenly the whole country was led by, you know, armed groups everywhere, in Tripoli, in Benghazi, in Sirte, and everywhere, in Darna. And we started losing little by little these voices, you know, the voice that we gained. And there was then this surge of attacking the civil activists, al-Musmari, and then, you know, many of the civil activists started being assassinated in Benghazi, in Derna, in Sabha, in Tripoli. And this led then to the 2014 conflict that, and the start of the war in Benghazi in May 2014. And in June, we thought the elections, the elections, I think that you also mentioned that in the book, which is something really, so I think Fred mentions everything really. So he's really, he really shows that the work of 7 years, in this book, is very clearly, a lot of on-the-ground experience. And real knowledge of what was going on in Libya, because the elections that happened in 2012 were a bit too early. We have to admit that. We were not ready for democracy yet. We were not aware of what happened. And that's why in 2012, the elections were manipulated, because who won the elections did not really get the leadership after that. So we killed democracy right then. But then we wanted to have another election, so maybe to fix the first election, but it didn't work out. And the day of election, another tragedy happened, and the death of my first cousin, Salwa. And tragically, I was involved. I was leading the second largest hospital in Libya, in Benghazi. And every time, when Chris died, he was brought to the Benghazi Medical Center. Salwa died, she was brought to the Benghazi Medical Center. And in between them, there was a lot of dead bodies, a lot of missing people. The Benghazi Medical Center had the only forensic medicine and morgue in town, so everybody was brought there. And it was horrible because, I remember very well this man who used to come every day to check on his brother in the morgue. Every time he hears a missing, some unidentified body is brought, he comes to see if it's his brother. And then he leaves every day. And one day I saw him by chance, and I knew about him and I knew him. And I saw that in his face that again, he saw someone in the morgue and it wasn't his brother. So I wanted to console him and support him. And he told me, I wish it was him because I want a closure. I am tired of coming every day to look at dead people. And I'm tired of thinking of my brother. Although he said I wanted him to be alive, but at this point of time, even if he's dead, that would be fine for me. I want a closure. The same thing happened after Salwa's death. Aysam went missing, her husband. And his sister would be calling me every day in the hospital and asking me, Layla, any news? It was horrible. We went through very sad, terrible times. It was draining, it was painful. And obviously, what was going on the political end, which Fred explains very well in his book, is the big vacuum, which allowed for everybody to come and to, open the door for organized crime, for trafficking, for struggle, power struggles, for control by different types of militias, for terrorism, for extremists. Libya became, a haven for all kinds and sorts of things that we never expected, to see or happen in our country, because there is a bit of a mention of the beautiful history of Libya, that goes to 12,000 years ago with the Phoenicians, with the Greeks, with the Italians, 2,000 kilometers of beautiful almost virgin Mediterranean shore, one of the cleanest shores, of the Mediterranean. Beautiful ruins, Roman and Greek, and beautiful desert, and a lot of resources. We are a very rich country with very poor people. Gaddafi managed to loot the country over 43 years. And I was reading this book the other day called The Looting Machine by Tom Burgess, and he was talking about the looting of the African nations, the sub-Saharan African nations, and I thought he was talking about Libya too. This is why I think Ghassan Salame changed his word corruption to perdition, because it's extreme. So this is really what, this is really what's happening in Libya, and this is what also is, written. I've quoted a lot of things here, but I really don't have to go back to them because I think I've mentioned them while I was saying. So the book really captures the dilemma we are in as Libyans, but also captures the dilemma of the international community in dealing with Libya. And it it also, talks about the failures of Libyan leadership to get the country out of this mess, but also the failure of the international community to support us and to stop the proxy war, which is one of the most important things, that's really going on in Libya. I mean, countries are fighting their wars in Libya, and the Libyan people are suffering.
Fred, I wanted to bring it back briefly to the political picture and ask you, at some point, a view took hold, I think, in the West about Libya. I think probably a couple of years, maybe several years after the revolt, a kind of fatalistic view took hold that what happened in the beginning, in 2011, with the NATO intervention and that 8-month bloody conflict, really kind of that set the course, and that the fragmentation of the country was inevitable at that point. Now, as you say, nothing was set in stone here, but I do wonder if you could talk about missed opportunities in that period, because I think a lot of people have this idea that perhaps there could have been a different course taken, that perhaps you might have avoided all that war if there had been some possibility of a diplomatic compromise with Qadhafi, or maybe not. But are there other possibly missed opportunities in that first period? And if you could also talk a bit about, and maybe one of the reasons this didn't happen was the role of regional powers, like Egypt in particular, and later the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and the role they play.
I mean, these sorts of counterfactuals. I mean, look, could a diplomatic solution have been reached? I mean, the U.S. diplomats that I interviewed that were on the receiving end of these proposals, from the regime, none of them seemed genuine. The speech by Saif al-Islam on February 20th, I think, really crystallized this notion that the regime was in it for, its survival. The argument that was made to me was there was no status quo ante to return to, that once, okay, maybe he had suppressed Benghazi, but then there was still this uprising, there was still that bubbling, and maybe the Arab powers would have gone in anyway. So there's all sorts of scenarios we could have worked through. The missed opportunities, I think, during the revolution, the role of European states and regional states in arming different militias that then later became the key players in the struggle for Tripoli, and especially the quickness of the fall of Tripoli, and there was no coherent plan for securing the city. There were competing plans, by the Qataris and the Emiratis. So that regional rivalry, I think, played a huge role early in the revolution. But the biggest missed opportunity, I think, was one of willpower, where the Americans had multiple assessments and multiple plans about what would happen, and many of them were optimistic. They thought that this country had oil reserves, that it was, the infrastructure was intact, so it would be a quick recovery. But as one experienced foreign service officer told me, he said, this wasn't our first rodeo. We'd done these things before, like in Afghanistan and Iraq. We should have. So the failure wasn't one of anticipation; it was one of will. To actually have a presence and to do something on the ground. I think there was an over-optimism about elections. The literature on post-conflict states suggests when you rush to elections, there's a strong risk of a return to conflict in states that don't have a culture of consensus and the foundation for democracy. And I asked one senior policymaker, did anyone try to put the brakes on this? And the answer was, the Libyans are owning this. We're not running a protectorate. And so everybody was moving toward these elections. And it was possible in those early months to be guardedly optimistic. The oil rebounded. There were militias, but the voting was going on. And so there was this, just sense of a rush to elections. And then, once those elections happened, it was sort of like, we've done our job here. Now we've got these other crises, Syria, Ukraine. And so Missed opportunities. I mean, there, the issue of the UN presence, perhaps some limited stabilization force, the way the Libyan government, the transitional council, and then the Libyan government started spending money early on. I mean, especially the payments to the militias. These were all things that, and again, it gets to this philosophical question about how much oversight and authority should the U.S. or internationals have over Libyans who, it's a noble cause. Let Libyans decide it, but Libyans, we're not equipped to decide it.
Yeah. And that question of disarming seems a central one to me, as you say. Was there anybody who had the authority, the moral or, God knows, political authority to disarm them after Qadhafi's death?
I'm reminded of this anecdote where there was a transitional council member in Benghazi who told Chris Stevens, he said, these young men that are carrying weapons, they're our sons. They'll disarm when we tell them, And Chris was immediately suspicious. And of course, the problem is, you had the real revolutionaries who fought Qadhafi, but then in that first year, you had the mushrooming of the militias because the government started paying salaries to militias at the end of 2011, which created this genie. And so some militias, you could argue, did play a role in protecting their communities, but others became predatory. They evolved on their own logic. They started advancing their political interests. And so the question of disarming and demobilization was never fully addressed. It wasn't simply a question of more jobs, although that was important. How do you get these young men out of the militias when they're getting an income, when they have this identity? But it was also one of political trust. I mean, the different factions, the two towns that were grappling over Tripoli, Misrata and Zintan, used their militias to project their influence. You had the growth of Islamist militias, and so quickly it became this problem that no one has been able to deal with.
You think, and I don't want to make you go on too deeply about this, but I'm just curious, do you think that if the United States or, let's say, the European countries had in fact decided to create some kind of protectorate to guide Libya a little more firmly, would there have been an armed uprising against it?
These are always issues. I mean, this is. I mean, the Libyans were, adamant about not having an occupation force. I mean, they did not want boots on the ground, and they were always divided, I think, about how much assistance they wanted. And so, no, I mean, this is a valid point. So.
Before we go to questions from the audience, just wanted to briefly touch on the question of Hiftar. As we all know from the newspapers, he's not well. There's the possibility of some kind of transition. Talk about that. What does it mean, and what's happening on the ground as people take that news in?
Right. Well, I mean, when I first interviewed him in June 2014, it was clear that he was leading a coalition of interests that had aligned behind him for their own specific purposes, and different tribes, federalists, security men, disaffected military units, and so. From the beginning, it was much more divided than people realized, and the Eastern Libya is a diverse place with different centers of power, with different tribes, and so in the last months, even before his illness, I think you started having that that coalition start to fracture, especially after he presented the liberation of Benghazi. Tribes were asking, look, we supported you in this. We're not getting what we wanted. There were jostling. There were competition between different centers of power. I mean, the big question is this going to hold together in his absence? A number of figures have been put forward to command the Libyan National Army, but that's only part of the equation. I think you're going to see the East sort of really open up, as a place of contestation between people in the LNA, between different tribes. There was this notion that it was all, under his control, which was always somewhat fictive. It might be a positive thing in the sense that if there's a figure that's more amenable to reconciliation with the West, that might be a good thing. But then also the question of, who can speak for Eastern Libya and who can deliver. And the East has its own serious grievances and issues beyond what Hiftar was portraying. So.
I just make some comments, on this issue. Well, just on the last issue, I mean, things in the East are still under control. The HOR are taking care of matters, really. And so far, things have not gotten out of hand. So let's hope that, you know, the hard work that's going on now on reconciliation of institutions and people is going to progress. And we are really hopeful that maybe we can, you know, there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. But I wanted to comment on the DDR program, the disarmament. I mean, one of the most important things, and which you mentioned in your book actually, is the arms influx in Libya. So everybody is bringing arms to different groups in Libya that are combating and fighting each other. And I don't want to go through the list of countries, but you have got a very long list of countries there. So, I mean, the first I think here is to stop this influx of arms. So if you want to work on stopping on GDR, you got to first stop the proxy war, stop the influx of weapons, and then you have to have an alternative plan to all of these young men who also in the book is mentioned that many of them are either students or engineers or unemployed youth who have got no resources, no jobs. So there needs to be a plan to take all of these youths and give them something, an education, a future, something to do. And that's how we can start, to disarm them. But obviously, as you said, Fred, we cannot, it's a big project that we would, need a lot of help on. And I think that one of the most important things is that the GDR started, plans for it started, in as early as 2013 with Zaidan. But everything that, it seems that the international community has got a problem with continuity. So all of the plans, they start and then they fall apart. Just like, in 2011, we started so many projects like the National Protection Against Violence, for gender-based violence. We signed contracts with the Mass General Hospital for training emergency doctors, with Toronto, with the cardiac doctors, to train our surgeons. We started so many things, but then there is always, things do not continue. There is always discontinuity, and this doesn't really help. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention these things because there is a place for GDR, but there is no will, the political will, on both sides, on the Libyan side, but also on the international community side. So, and I think when I say this, I know that we are running short of time, but I know that a lot of people say, so why should we help you? Why don't you do it by yourselves? But I think that we have, the international community owes us the fact that we had been occupied for a very long period of time, and we only got our independence in 1951, and the fact that our resources has always been used by the region and the international community, and the fact that we want to be a member of this globe and of the international community, I think it obligates the international community to help us to make it. So,
Okay, I'd like to open it to questions from the audience. And can you state your name briefly, and please only questions.
My name is Ali Abu Zakuk, Libyan American activist. Question, very simple, Fred. Thank you for the book and a good work. I started reading it. I just received it last night. And I want to ask you a question out of my experience with you. If you put a SWOT analysis, the pros and cons, how could you give us a blueprint of what can Libya be seen through your experience? The points of the positive points that can build the country, the negative points that can pull the country down. You can, I'm an expert in civil society organizations, but I think you know what I meant.
Sure.
So please give us a brief idea, because you are very well acquainted with the situation in Libya.
Well, I mean, I think the bright spots are things that the international community recognized early on that the country has a small population, it's concentrated geographically, enormous oil wealth at its disposal. I think one of the positive things now that we need to build on is municipal level governance. I mean, this is one of the success stories where you have elected municipal councils that do enjoy legitimacy, that are answerable to their constituencies, that are trying to deliver services, that are bringing in income, that are talking to one another in ways that the national actors are not. And so I think that's, a strong, building block. I mean, the cliche is, building from the grassroots, but I think there's something there. The national level process is frozen, so let's work in local communities. The problem though is that can only take you so far because of the gridlock at the top and the economic problems, the divided economic institutions. So, that's, I think, one bright spot. And then, as Dr. Layla, mentioned, I think just the enormous, resilience of the people, that spirit of civic activism, I think, still thrives. You have, a number of, youth groups, you have entrepreneur groups, tech startups. These are all things that the international community recognizes and needs to support. We've covered we've covered all of them, and unfortunately, my book talks a lot about them. Yeah, the book doesn't get into it too much, but I think the recent, is just the degradation of the economy and the plunder and sort of Libyans have not been served well by their political class, ordinary Libyans, and then the culture of the armed groups is still, thriving. I think the international community has, in some sense, supported that by pursuing short-term aims. So let's focus on countering ISIS. We're going to work through, militias, through factions on the ground. Let's counter the migrant challenge. And so these international interventions are, unhelpful to the larger cause of a cohesive state.
Thank you very much. Edward Joseph, National Council on U.S.-Libya Relations. Fred, congratulations on the book. It sounds absolutely terrific. You used the word preordained. It was not preordained. I just have to say that listening to Ms. Bougaikis describe these eggshell institutions, complete lack of experience with civil society, I have to say it's just astonishing that anyone thought it would have finished any other way, given the experience not just in the Middle East, but in the Balkans, continuing struggles in Eastern Europe and the Balkans with transition, and why anyone would have thought it would somehow be different in Libya is astonishing to me. Fred, my question is, comes from your testimony last week before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Middle East, North Africa. And in it you said that there is you referred accurately to the yawning national level political divide in Libya. And and you just referred to it just before. So my question for you is, what is driving that yawning national level political divide? And does the UN setup, this UN roadmap, address that, the real driver of that divide? Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, you've had 3+ years of conflict in Benghazi. You've had the development of parallel institutions in the east. You've had massive displacement of populations from Benghazi. I think you've had a real hardening of identities that I encountered in the east, and this sense of the grievances have really solidified into something, and you have proto-state institutions. I think it's not simply an east-west divide. It's often related to people who want to preserve some aspect of the old order versus the so-called revolutionary actors who want to remake it and exclude certain people from that, people who were part of the Qadhafi system. So these are, they're not irreparable. We've seen Zintan and Misrata, these two towns that were at loggerheads, made peace. Does the UN, process address it? I think it's the best thing that they have right now. The LPA, for all of its flaws, is a mark on the wall. It's worthy of amendments. The the roadmap of a national conference to set up a constitution, I think is a worthy, objective. I think there are talks now among different armed groups that we're not talking to one another, which is positive. The HOR is meeting with the High State Council, so there are, Libyans are interacting with one another. Now, I mean, can the real, roots of the grievances be addressed through a settlement? No. I mean, we're talking about undoing decades of neglect in the East. We're talking about a mechanism for wealth distribution. I mean, these are huge challenges. We're talking about reunifying the security sector in a way that addresses local imperatives, for governance. And so it's going to be a long haul. So.
Sir?
I look at Libya. My name is Fatih Sikta. And when I look at Libya and the Arab world in general, most of the Arab countries are run by tyrants. But Libya was very, very special. If I look at Egypt, Tunisia, those were states. They had institutions, had political parties, but in Libya, we had nothing. We had Gaddafi, and Gaddafi was the state. So when gone, we lost everything. And we were left alone. So don't you think and agree with me that what is happening in Libya and what has happened was bound to happen?
Mm-hmm.
And what we are going through right now is a phase in our history that will lead us eventually to recovery, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to go through this,
Mm-hmm.
because we had to do it on our own. Okay, so I think that's what in Libya, a lot of people blame. But this leads me to the second part of my question, which is the most. Excuse me. And this leads me to the second part of my question. What is in your assessment right now to the root cause of the problem, what's going on right now, why we're failing to reach a political solution? The main reason, because if you solve that, you will solve the Libyan case. And the reason changes as we went through from 2011 until now.
Mm.
So I have an answer for that, but I need to know yours.
Well, I appreciate your long view of history, and I mean, I think revolutions take a long time, and I say in the preface of my book that Libya's story is not over. So this is an ongoing process. I mean, look, what's the root? I mean, if you listen to the UN's latest assessment, it's primarily an economic struggle for power, with political positions are sort of the front for actors to accrue political wealth. I think that's part of the story. I think we're still grappling with this question that all revolutions confront, which is how much of the old order do you include, how much do you exclude? We're grappling with hyper-localization, where because of the absence of institutions during and after the revolution, people gravitated toward these towns that are now acting as autonomous, semi-autonomous units, and so everything is hyper-localized. And so there's often this deceptive notion that some U.S. policymakers have advanced to me that, it's a small population, you should be able to get the top 9 people in a room and hammer out an agreement, which we've seen has not worked because of the diffusion of power. It gives the authority to spoilers, to spoil the process. We've heard about the other root causes of regional neglect, about unifying political institutions. I think the other piece of it is the internationalization of the conflict. It's not solely the Middle East powers, but it's European states. We have the role of Russia now, and so these disparate international approaches to Libya's conflict have prolonged the conflict. They've given factions patrons to turn to, and the weapons coming in, was a major turning point in the road to civil war in 2014. Some of these states are still hedging. So I think unfortunately, Libya has fallen victim to this regional proxy war. So.
This gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Ahmed Ali, and I am a Libyan, and I'm also a teacher assistant at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So I just want to go back to some points raised by Ms. Selwa. She said that so I'm not pro-Qaddafi, but it's not right for our lawyers and judges to say that the law system was corrupt or was not transparent, because the Mustafa Abdel Jalil, in his latest interview, and he was the leader of the National Transitional Committee, he said that the law system during Gaddafi times was transparent, and it was somehow, even with the mistakes of the regime, they were able to fix some of these mistakes. However, I feel that even starting with 2008, and the regime started this reconciliation system, and a lot of the opposition who were outside, they came to Libya and they started working with Gaddafi and his son, and also they were giving substantial amount of money as compensation, and they started working with the government. But then they turned the table over, and things just changed, and Libyan really trusted those those people. But what happened is that when crisis occurred, they just fled the country. And I feel that one of the things that led to Libya to be a failed state is the social context, the tribal nature of it's very difficult. I come from a city which is really, let me give you one example. Right now, the college is controlled by one tribe. The hospital is controlled by one tribe. You cannot go to college because it's not safe for you to be in there. So how do you see the social context, given that you've been in Libya for, I think, 7 years, you said?
Not during different visits. So the social context in terms of the role of tribes, or what?
Yes. Do you feel that were you ready for that? Like to leave out this idea of tribes controlling everything.
Tribes, I mean, it's interesting. They're not a political identity. Tribes don't have a political party. You find people in one tribe are on opposite sides of political conflicts. In the conflict in Benghazi, some were, with the Islamists, some were anti. So it crosses over. I think tribes is an important social identity. I don't think it's antithetical to democracy. I don't think you can say because you're a tribal society you're not ready. This is the classic argument of strongmen. I mean, tribal sentiment, plays a role. It's one identity of many that I think Libyans are able to coexist with, and tribes have played a very beneficial role in Libya in mediating social conflicts, in stepping in where there's no formal institution. So, these are important developments. Unfortunately, I think tribalism has, become somewhat malignant. There's a sort of tribal supremacism that arises in certain places, but that's a result of conflict, of social breakdown.
Thank you for your comment, which is very interesting. I'm going to comment, actually, talking about the law, which you have stated that existed during Gaddafi regime, and tribalism. Funny enough, they're entwined, because I lived in Libya most of my life, and for decades during the Gaddafi regime, there was no law to, for example, when somebody commits a crime in Libya, he doesn't go through the normal channels of justice. He is not prosecuted, and he is not tried, and he doesn't get what he deserves. Rather, the tribe, meets with the other tribe, the perpetrator's tribe, with the victim's tribe, and we say a joke in Libya, we say they sit and eat rice and meat, and then this is it, and everybody goes their own way. So what Gaddafi did, when I grew up in the early 70s, I was a child, but I remember very well that in Benghazi, I didn't know that I come from a certain tribe in Libya. The first time I learned of me belonging to a tribe was during the college days when I was called by the revolutionary committees of Gaddafi and interrogated because my father was a political prisoner. And they asked me, which tribe do you belong to? And I was like, what? I gave my family name. No, which tribe? You're not Libyan. I said, I am Libyan. My 4 grandparents are Libyan. My ancestors go back 400 years in Benghazi. What are you talking about? He said, no, we didn't know about tribalism. Because what happened is after the independence, there was modernization. There was the start of building of a civil modern state. There was starting to build the rule of law and the proper, the real makeup of a state, okay, and the tools that build a state. And there was a constitution, and we signed the conventions, the human rights conventions, and we were trying to implement them. When Gaddafi came, he just abolished everything. He abolished the constitution, ignored the human rights laws, and he brought back the tribalism. He is the one who actually brought back the tribalism and made the tribe become the law in Libya. And this is really bad because, you are a young man, but if you read the history of the caveman, you know that he came out from the cave to the tribe, then from the tribe to the city. So we can't go backwards. We want to move forwards.
I think, do we have time for one more question? Or one more question. Okay, great. Maybe this gentleman here.
My name is Dave Ballard. Thank you for your presentations, and I was particularly touched, Dr. Leila, by your evocation of the feeling in Benghazi and in the country as a whole at the time in 2011 when people had hope for a new government. I followed Libya closely for quite a while, and I had that same feeling. I had the same feeling probably from about 2005 up until about that time. I don't have that feeling anymore, and when I look at Libya, what I actually see is Somalia, and I would like both of you perhaps to convince me that Libya is somehow in a better shape than Somalia is. Other than proximity to Europe, I don't see any difference between them.
Your country.
Oh my God, okay. Funny enough, and with all due respect to Somalia and to other poor sub-Saharan African nations, I was just talking, before we came in to Fred, and I said when we used to watch the news in Libya about Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, we used to think, what's wrong with these people? They're so backward, they're still carrying guns and shooting each other. We never expected that we're going to go, in the same direction. But now Somalia is a completely different story, but I'm talking about Libya, my homeland, because I want to pretend to say that I know it very well, okay? Now, the story of Libya is not unique in the world. It's the story of so many other countries across the globe that suffered from occupation after occupation, from tyranny, from abuses, and then, went through revolutions to liberate themselves and to reach to, the level where there is some humanity, okay, where there is some, civility, humanity, and where there is citizenship and citizen rights. And this is where we want to go, the social justice, the constitution, the human rights, the citizenship rights. And so our road, unfortunately, we thought that at this time, during this time, in 2011, with all of the support from the international community, we thought that we would make it and we wouldn't have to go through the very dark path that other nations went through before they came to light and became civilized. But sadly, I guess not. We are not getting any help. We are getting actually a proxy war and a lot of meddling, and this is not helping at all. The majority of Libyan people, I can assure you, are not holding the guns, are not killing each other, are not involved in what's happening. It's actually this what you see and what's happening at all levels of the Libyan conflict represents the represents the extreme group of people who are on the scene. But sadly, when you have got the resources, which are the weapons here, the guns, and when you have people who are supplying you continuously with guns, then you have the power. Because right now in Libya, there is the rule of the gun, and so everyone else has to keep quiet. But we are hoping that maybe, through people, who talk about Libya, through our diplomatic efforts, through talking about our homeland, through writing books about Libya, like what Fred did, through these events, to raise more awareness about Libya and about the need for us to get more help so that we can actually get out of this conflict. But I don't want you to despair. And let's hope that maybe in 10 years, we can meet again and then talk about some bright days in Libya. And I hope that we are not going to go down the dark side for long.
Fred, do you want to address?
I can't say it any better than that. That's a great way to end it.
Well, a good note to end on. And let me just briefly say there was a reception next door right now happening, so please join us for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
Okay.
Sure.
كيف حالك أنت؟
You have a why at the end, right?